I wrote that quite some time ago, so it barely rings a bell for me. So I'm glad some of you guys remember it. But yeah, like Richard said, my name is Julio Anta. I am the author of Frontera, also Home, and most recently a book called Si Se Puede, whose subtitle is The Latino Heroes Who Changed the United States. It's a nonfiction graphic novel. And a little bit about me. I was born in Miami, Florida. I live in New York City now. My family is both Cuban and Colombian American. My father is Cuban. He came to the United States when he was 5 years old, a few years after the Cuban Revolution. And growing up in Miami, it's a very Cuban American town, if any of you are familiar at all. Um, and then on my mom's side, her parents came to the US from Colombia. They were undocumented, just on a regular travel visa, tourist visa, and then they overstayed, and my mom was born, like 5 years later. So that's where I come from. Miami is a very insular Latino community. Spanish was my first language. It's the language that most people will speak to you if you walk into a store or a restaurant uh, before they speak to you in English. So it's very much a community that I grew up. All of my friends were either they were from somewhere else or their parents were from somewhere else, primarily Latin America. And I grew up not feeling any different about being Latino, about speaking Spanish with my family in public, until I left Miami for the first time. Was the first time I really started to experience what how the rest of the country looks at us, right? I'd certainly seen discrimination in Miami, mostly against African Americans or against Asian people, but never against Latinos because we were the majority. 70% of Miami is Latino. And of course, there's issues of colorism, but for the most part, it was a childhood that was very different than the childhood that a lot of Latino kids have in the United States. Um, so when I left for the first time, I started to see what how people really thought about us, the thoughts on immigration that were different from what I grew up in. And then, of course, by 2016, we had an election, a new president that really brought that to the surface. Um, and that's what inspired my book Home. For those of you who are not familiar, Home is a graphic novel about a young boy from Guatemala who comes to the U.S. right around the time that the family separation policy is being enacted. And like a lot of kids, he's separated from his mom. But unlike a lot of kids, he has superhuman powers. So now he has the ability to do something about his situation. And of course, that also introduces the question about, what kind of responsibility does he have? Should he be hiding who he is, or should he be open about it and use it to do something about it? Um, so I think for me, the dual threads of leaving Miami and then the 2016 election were really radicalizing moments for me in my own personal politics and the way that I experienced uh, being a Latino in the United States. Prior to that, growing up, I came into contact with punk and hardcore music, which I would say that and skateboarding were like the biggest influences on my life. They introduced me to politics that were not the politics that I grew up with. Miami, like I said, is very Cuban American, which also generally means very conservative. And so I grew up in a very conservative environment. And then when I came into contact with skateboarding, with punk and hardcore, I was learning about, the anti-war movement. I was learning about, what, Cuban Americans are generally not vegetarian or vegan. This was the first time I was ever, coming into contact with that being a lifestyle that people have. I also, for the first time, was coming into contact with people that, were gay and queer that were open about it, at least, by playing in bands and going to shows. So it was really this politically, eye-opening experience, and then coupled with leaving Miami for the first time, and a lot of reading that I was doing. I was reading books like A People's History of the United States and Harvest of Empire by Juan Gonzalez and Open Veins of Latin America. and really for the first time starting to understand how the US interacts with the rest of the world and how the US specifically interacts with Latin America, which really became sort of the cornerstone to the work that I would do as a writer in graphic novels, and then also in the work that I do for film and TV and animation. Really, that's all at the core of what I do. It's taking my own family history and then also the history of Latin America and introducing that in a way that is at least interesting for me. So as a writer, Home was my first project, and learning about family separation was something that was really emotional for me because, like I said, my father was 5 years old when he came to this country. I saw him in the eyes of a lot of these kids that were being torn away from their parents. I also had a 3-year-old son at the time, so I saw him in their eyes as well, and started to realize all of the ways that through little changes in history that could have been us, right? That could have been us being cruelly torn away at the southern border as a way to just send a message to the rest of Latin America, which was simply, don't come. We don't want you here. If you come, we'll take away your child. So Home was really my way of sort of dealing with that and sort of exercising those feelings that I had, that anger that I had, and using a medium that I love, which is comic books and graphic novels, to share that story. And it also became sort of the blueprint for all the other work that I would do, which is taking something that I'm passionate about, something like, in that case, immigration in the US, and in the case of Frontera as well. But then in terms of fiction, finding an angle that changes the story so that it's still grounded. All of my work is extremely grounded in reality and in nonfiction and in true lived-in stories, but adding a new element to it. So in Home, it was a play on superheroes and taking the general superhero blueprint, which is a heroic, hero that fights against criminals and, like Batman, turns them into the police, or fights street thugs like Spider-Man, who are oftentimes people of color and immigrants. And with Home, sort of turn it on its head, right, and make something that was more similar to the worldview that I have and the experience that me and my family have, which is that the state is the villain, not the other way around, and the immigrant child is the hero. And with Frontera, it was using magical realism, which, as a Colombian American, is a huge part of the literature that I grew up with in my house. Authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez with 100 Years of Solitude, and truly just like this long history of magical realism in Colombian literature. And using that as a way to tell a story of a boy that is deported and now is trying to make his way back home to the US. And that could have been a totally grounded story without any supernatural elements. But for me, it was important to be able to tell these stories in a way that is maybe more, people could maybe relate to more. I often find that adding a supernatural element to stories makes people see things from a different perspective than if it was just this straight nonfiction story or a news piece. So with Frontera, it was also, like Home, inspired by true events, right? So if you read Frontera, you know about Guillermo, the ghost character, and his history in the Bracero program. That obviously is inspired by real life history. You know about the water aid stations, which also is something that many volunteers will fill up throughout the Sonoran Desert to help migrants stay alive in a very inhospitable environment. Another aspect of it was the Tohono O'odham indigenous reservation, and that obviously is also real. And also the dichotomy of the different perspectives on the res. So, I think one of the main themes of a lot of my work is trying to combat the idea of the monolith. And the monolith obviously is the idea that all Latinos are this way, all African Americans are this way, all, Asian people are that way, when in reality, we are extremely diverse within our own communities. I think especially within the Latino community, where we are of all different races. We come in from a US perspective, we come from many different generations of migration. Um, I grew up in Miami, which is now turned into sort of the financial capital of Latin America. So you have people like me who grew up, I would say initially very poor and eventually middle class. And you also have, some of the richest people from Latin America who moved to Miami uh, to have a life there. So there's this huge dichotomy within our community. And the same thing applies to the res that our character Darcy is part of. So she talks about how, there are some people who are very anti-immigrant within the res. They don't want migrants crossing through the reservation. And there's others like her that man these aid stations, that put out aid for other people. And then another big part of the magical realism was the introduction of the character of El Jefe, who is also a real life jaguar that when I was doing research for this book, I learned that El Jefe was a jaguar that was tracked by wildlife groups within the US side of the Sonoran Desert. But most of his species is found on the Mexican side of the US border. And for me, that was a way of talking about the ways that border walls impact not just humans, but wildlife as well. And then obviously drawing a parallel between El Jefe and Mateo and the way that their stories are interlinked, despite the fact that one is a human and one is a jaguar. And the magical realism in that aspect for me was a way of sort of, giving them this sort of psychic connection. So like I said, magical realism was sort of there from the beginning in that book. Frontera was originally the idea for Frontera was just the Guillermo character. And just to give you like a little peek behind the curtain and how working in publishing is not always a straight line in terms of like what your career trajectory is. Frontera was originally a pitch for a 10-page anthology story that me and Jacoby, the illustrator that I worked in, we pitched it to an anthology and we were actually denied. We didn't get into the anthology. But we loved the idea so much that we kept pursuing it and eventually turned it into a full graphic novel. But originally it was just Guillermo. It was just this story about a ghost character that has been stuck in the Sonoran Desert for half a century and how he's seen the desert change throughout his entire afterlife in the desert. But then when we started thinking about expanding the story, I discovered the Mateo character and a way for that to sort of ground the reader in real life, but still having that magical realism section to it as well. And yeah, Frontera, it came out in July. Since then, like I said, I've had Si Se Puede, which came out in the fall. And then this fall, I'm doing a book with DC Comics about Blue Beetle. I don't know if any of you guys saw the new movie, which I really loved. It's about the Blue Beetle character, but again, like all of my work very much grounded in real life. So yeah, I think that's a little bit of an intro on the work that I do. And I'm happy to open it up to questions and answer any questions you guys have about the book or about working in publishing or comics or really anything.
Thanks, Julio. Matt, do you want to? Yeah, you might have to get closer. Just
I'm just gonna take this.
yeah.
All right, so I just have a few questions that you actually touched on a lot for most of them. But my first question is, why did you choose to do a graphic novel as opposed to a short story to drive the narrative? And in what way do you think that the graphic novel with magical realist elements as opposed to a short story succeeded in telling the story and reaching the target audience?
Sure. By short story, I'm assuming you mean like prose, non-comic format.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be dishonest to not just mention like the practical part of it, which is that for me, at least, it's much easier to write a graphic novel. because when you write a graphic novel, you write a script first. And in that script, you break down each page into panels, right? So like my script will say page 1, panel 1, a description of what's on the panel, and then any dialogue or narration, and then panel 2, and the same until, you know, you've written 250 pages of that. So with a script, the nice part about that from a practical sense is that your panel descriptions are only going to be seen by the artist that you're working with and by your editor. So I can write something as simply as Mateo runs towards the reader. And that's it. That's all I have to write for a panel, right? If I'm writing it as a prose story, the reader reads everything, right? So every single word counts. So that's the practical aspect. I personally just find it easier to write scripts, whether it's for a graphic novel or a screenplay, than for a prose novel. But for me, like I mentioned earlier a little bit, I grew up reading comics and graphic novels. For me, this is what I definitely read chapter books as a kid, and read novels, but graphic novels are what stuck with me the most. These were the stories that I felt like made the biggest impact on my worldview and the way that I saw things. So when I first had the idea for Home, for example, it was just, it was just an easy decision. Immediately, I thought, I want to make a comic because that's what I know, that's what I love. And also because I felt at the time, and I do still feel today, that the comic book and graphic novel space is really lacking in the kinds of stories that I am interested in and that I like to tell, as opposed to the prose novel or short story prose space. In comics, if we're thinking about like comics you buy at a comic book store, it's almost, I would say, like 70% superhero comics. So with Home, I thought I want to reach that audience by telling a superhero story about an issue that I'm passionate about. But with Frontera, where it's a YA graphic novel, it's the intended audience is 13 to 17-year-olds. Even though I like to think that all of my work can be read by ages above the intended audience as well, because frankly, like, I'm writing the books that I want to read. If a book like Frontera already existed, I'd just read it. I wouldn't be writing my own version of it. But what I think is really special about graphic novels and comics is that it's the only medium that the reader drives the pacing of it. It's not like film or TV where you press play and you watch it, and sure, you can pause and go to the bathroom, but you're not, rarely are you going back or fast forwarding and jumping through the way that in a comic, you can set the pace for how you read it, and you can spend as much time as you want on each panel, right? As a writer, I can do things like do a splash page or a double page spread or larger panels or smaller panels that sort of set the pace for how much time I want the reader to spend on each image. But really, to me, it's the most immersive form of media, certainly published media. But, for me, I think it's just this great space where you can show these visuals that, if I was writing a prose story, I could spend an entire page of a book describing, a setting. But in a graphic novel, I can write all of that as a panel description, and it might be a page long, but it's all just there for you to see it, right? I think about the scene in the market in Sasabe, in Frontera, where Mateo's walking through, and it's all there. Like, I like to think that you read that and you're immersed in that environment. And the same thing goes for the desert, the Sonoran Desert, where I think if you were reading a prose novel, you might imagine the Sonoran Desert like a typical desert that you see in a movie, or you might first think of just this barren wasteland, when in fact the Sonoran Desert is this, hugely diverse ecological area where there's all sorts of wildlife and trees and bushes and shrubbery, all sorts of things, right? And I think Jacoby does a beautiful job illustrating that. But that's also, to me, I think, a really special part about graphic novels. You can show the reader exactly what you want them to see.
Yeah.
Did that answer everything?
Yep. Yeah, I definitely agree with you on the graphic novels being like that because we haven't read anything like that for this class yet. So I'm really glad we got the chance to read something like this.
Cool.
As a follow-up to the first question, what was there a single hardest part in writing Frontera? Was there like writing block or
Hmm.
solving a character conflict or something like that?
Yeah, I wrote this book. We sold this book to our publisher February 2020. So literally a month before the pandemic shutdowns. So I was writing this book in, the worst part of the pandemic, when you're like scheduling your day about around like when is the best time to go to the grocery store, like when are you going to be like, are you going to be able to get food, like all of these things, when like, you know all these things that we think back at the pandemic now and think, oh, that was silly, like leaving your clothes in the garage, like all sorts of things, right? Like that was, we were in that when I was writing this book. So it was really difficult to separate like my daily anxieties about like, you know, where am I going to get toilet paper? Like they didn't have toilet paper today and we have one roll left. Like where am I going to find this, and all of that kind of stuff. And separating that from the creative work, which to me is really what I try to like have my whole life revolve around. Um, so I would say that was the most difficult part. But about the story, you know, the character of Guillermo changed a lot when we pitched it as that 10-page anthology comic. Guillermo was like a 30-year-old man. And it was our editor's idea to age him down so that he and Mateo would have even more parallels, right, between like what their Guillermo's life was like, 70 years ago and what Mateo's is today, but then also the similarities between them, the things that don't change. Um, so with a book like this, which was my first traditionally published book, Home was published by Image Comics, which is like uh, a publisher that works mostly with comic book stores. Frontera was published by HarperCollins, which is like a traditional book publisher. Um, so I just mentioned that to say that I lived with this idea for quite some time, right? So I became attached to what the idea was and who these characters were. So when that feedback came down from the editor, which now in hindsight, I think if we had done it the way that we initially intended, it'd be a totally different book. And I'm so grateful for that feedback that we got. But at the time, it was tough because now I had this idea that I had lived with for so long that I was now having to change and now having to accommodate this new voice, this editorial voice that was being brought in. Um, and this was my first time working with an editor, so it was also like having an editorial voice was also just overall a difficult adjustment. um, Now at this point, almost 4 years later, I've worked almost all the work I do is with an editor, and I'm almost afraid to work without an editor and not have that outside perspective that can challenge ideas and ask questions that lead me to new ideas. So that was challenging for sure. But I'll also say that one of my favorite parts about writing it was writing the dream sequence, um, because for me, like surrealism is a huge part of like the stories that I love to read, and like the films of people like David Lynch are huge for me, just like from an inspirational perspective. So a lot of my work does tend to have surrealism blended into it. So even though you didn't answer, I'll just say like the flip of that, which is like my favorite part, was definitely writing that dream sequence.
So throughout the story, as you said earlier in your intro, Mateo struggles with his Mexican American identity. How does your usage of both the English and Spanish language encompass the struggle and how does it reconcile this struggle? And again, you also mentioned it a little bit in your intro, but do you find Mateo's identity hardships to be reminiscent of your own or your family's?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll talk about the use of language first. If I had my way, and I know that this is, most of the decisions that I like to make creatively are not necessarily like great business and marketing decisions for the book. But if I had my way, like the Spanish parts would be written in Spanish and the English parts would be written in English. Obviously, this is a book that our publisher wants to market to the largest group possible. So we had to do little designations like we did in the book. But one of the things that I think was different about the way that we use language is that most books will put um, foreign languages in brackets, and English is just, what you're reading in English. For our book, it was the opposite, right? Where very early on in the book, you find out that all the dialogue that you're reading in English, you're supposed to imagine that it's being spoken Spanish. And then what we designate as being different or the other is English. Um, so so that's the language portion of it. As far as his identity, um, yeah, it's definitely for me, like I said, when I left Miami, there was like an identity sort of, I don't want to say identity crisis, but definitely it was the most I had thought about my identity ever, I think, is when I left. Because I was being confronted with feeling out of my element, feeling like I wasn't in the communities and the environments that I was used to, right? So Mateo's story is very different than that, whereas my family, there is a history of, deportation or the fear of deportation on my mom's side of the family. But on my dad's side, he never had to worry about papers because Cubans, until a few years ago, had a privilege that no other Latin American immigrants have ever had, which is that if you arrive in this country, you are safe from deportation. Um, and for those of you who don't know, it's a Cold War policy because Cuba is a communist country. But anyway, with Mateo, his identity crisis comes from the fact that he believed that he was born in the US. Um, and then when they get deported, his whole life changes. Or when he finds out that he's was born in Mexico, his whole perspective about who he is changes. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that we, even within our communities, uh, build hierarchies within, who has papers, who's undocumented, who is a quote unquote illegal, right? So I think Mateo, just by living in the United States, even though he was in Arizona, where there's obviously a huge Mexican American community, um, just by the fact that he lived in the US, he had those, I guess, those like built in prejudices about where he stood in the hierarchy of, Mexican Americans. And then that was all ripped away from him, right? So for me, the way that that ties to my story is I started feeling like an other for the first time after I left Miami. And that was an experience that made me start questioning what truly is my identity, right? Is it Cuban, Colombian American? Is it, an American citizen? Like, how do I view myself and the way that I interact with this country? So yeah, that was a huge part of the story. Like I said, he wasn't there from the start. Mateo didn't exist in the short story version of this. But he really just opened up the story, and the way that I related to Mateo is really what drove the story from beginning to end.
Could you talk more about El Jefe and I guess again you mentioned in your intro, but how the border affects not only just humans but animals, plants, and all of that?
Yeah, definitely. I think when we talk about immigration, we often use dehumanizing terms that you could very easily pass on to like animals, we talk about surges in migration, right? And migration patterns through the year, right? Like I could easily attribute that to ducks or any other migratory animal, right? And that's done on purpose. That language is used that way to dehumanize immigrants, and it's not something new. You know, it wasn't until, like I said, the 2016 election and family separation was an extremely radicalizing moment for me. And it took me down the road of trying to learn what is the history of immigration in this country. Is it truly this story of, um, we persecuted people came to the US and built this life, and they wanted to build this inclusive society that was a melting pot for all of the people in the world that are plagued by injustices, the Statue of Liberty, all of this myth that we've built around this country. And what I learned obviously was like, A, it was not right. But B, this history of excluding immigrants goes back from the beginning, whether it was in the times of, pilgrims in the revolution, or the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 30s, or the Bracero program, which we talk about, which invited Mexican farm workers to fill the jobs of US citizens that left to fight in the war, but then were promptly kicked out of the country when they weren't needed anymore, which is also just indicative of the way that Mexican Americans and Latino workers have been treated in this country, which is, we know that we need you during certain times, and when we don't need you, we're ready to deport you, right? And we also know that this economy would not function without undocumented and exploited undocumented people. So for me, it was important to take that history, but also highlight things, the way that the border impacts not just humans, but wildlife, right? And El Jefe, I thought, was a really good vehicle for that. I learned about El Jefe originally reading a really short graphic novel called The Scar. And it's a graphic novel that essentially, the thesis of it is that the border wall is a scar on the continent. And it talks about all the ways that the border wall, impacts daily life, right? Whether it's splitting cities apart, just like splitting El Paso from Mexico, or characters like El Jefe. And what's really interesting about El Jefe also is that right before the book came out, I was just doing some Googling, and I wanted to see if there's any new information on El Jefe. And it turns out that he's actually, for the first time, I think it was like in April of last year, for the first time, he was spotted on the Mexican side of the border, essentially reunited with the rest of his species. Whereas, from the moment that he was tracked in the US for the first time, he was never seen on the other side of the border. So yeah, he was a really important character, and one that, as we edited the book and shortened it, because my first draft of the book was much longer, he was someone that I really wanted to make sure we kept, and then also brought back for the third act finale of the book too.
Going off your dehumanization point that you made, I think there was one scene early in the story where Mateo, I forgot the character's name, but he called the one guy a coyote, and the guy was like,
Mhm.
"Don't say that, it's a derogatory term."
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. What I guess what term like would you use instead of coyote? Like,
I mean, it's so so the character is named Juan Javier, and for me, that character was important because we often think about coyotes, or people that are in a legal sense human traffickers, right? Um, we often think of them as like these dangerous cartel guys, who are, gonna rape women and do all these things, which is true, that does happen. And that my point in this scene was not to take away from those real experiences, but to also point out the reality, which is a lot of times this is a really like good way for young men, teenagers, and people in the early 20s to make money, to work for a group that hires out, these coyotes or these people that, will transport you across the border. And, they are just doing a job, right? They're just providing a service like an Uber driver would provide a service, but in a much more dangerous environment. So that's the point that I wanted to make with Juan Javier. But again, like I said, uh, there is truth to what we hear, the story that is propagated, the most through the media. It's not a made up story that really does happen. There are coyotes that, will take you into the middle of the desert and then abandon you and take all your money, you know, or that will, sexually abuse people and, deceive people. That all is true, but it's not the whole story. And that's what I wanted to say with the Juan Javier character.
Could you talk more about Guillermo? Because I didn't know that the original inspiration to Frontera was the character. I thought Mateo was the original inspiration. So I guess could you talk about the themes that he represents and maybe even talk about what your original plan before Frontera was going to be?
Yeah. So Guillermo, yeah, like I said, he was there from the very beginning. But his story originally was going to be a 10-page story where it basically does a lot of the work that we do in the scene that he takes Mateo and we do a flashback and see the way that his life has evolved over the years. Essentially, it was going to be a sort of exercise in showing the way that the border has changed and become more militarized, and essentially more dangerous by pushing migrants to more remote areas, more dangerous areas that are cut off from the rest of society. So the idea was to just, I think it was originally called Ofrenda, and the idea was that his family now, still 50 years later, still has him on their ofrenda, and then showing the story of his life and how through all of these years that they've had him on the ofrenda, what has happened throughout his life, and through that track that changes the border. But in this version of the story, he still serves the same purpose, which is to show the evolution, the militarization, and give a context to this world that Mateo has now been thrust into. But really, he serves obviously as his guide, but also as, a character that really just like straightens out this kid who's like just such a dick sometimes and like just such an asshole and so hard-headed. And that's important for him, right? Like his arc is an arc of a headstrong kid who desperately wants to get back to his life. But because of that desperation, he uses the knowledge that he has, that he feels confident about, that often is not the right decision, right? To starting at that place, but then eventually getting to a place where he realizes that he needs people's help. He needs community, which is Guillermo, which is Darcy, which is El Jefe, and eventually that whole migrant group that he comes in contact with as well. And yeah, so Guillermo for me was a way of exploring history, but then also adding in my own commentary, right, which is the Bracero program, his history as like a queer man in the Bracero program, which I think oftentimes the narrative is that the more we have queer people in media, the more people are convinced that they're queer, the more, there's never been this many queer people who've existed, which is not true, right? We know that people may feel more comfortable coming out now, but that doesn't change the fact that they've existed since the beginning of time. And even in this bracero program, in this hard manual labor environment that Guillermo lived in, queer people are there too, and we embody that in him, and in Felipe, which is the character that he falls in love with. And for me and for Jacoby, the artist, who's a queer artist, that was a super important part of the book for him and for me as well. Um, and I think it's also just like a really special reprieve in the story that brings us to this place where we can chill a little bit, right? And like get out of just like the constant threat of death and have like this sweet romantic story. So much so that like we've talked about doing a spin-off where it's that prequel essentially, because we love that story so much. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. My last question has to do with the ending of the book. What message did you want to leave the readers with? And considering the ending, were there any other alternative endings planned at all? And I guess how did you come to the current ending that you have?
Yeah. The message from the beginning, and truly I think with all of my work, is empathy. For me, storytelling, whether it's graphic novels or film, or even music, are just these like empathy building machines. You can engineer a story to make a character, to make the reader or the viewer empathize with that character. Um, you know, I think back to my own life, but also I think just in general, one of the real flaws I think of like humans in general is that we often fail to empathize with people that we haven't met or had interactions with. And I look back at, you know, a TV show like, I remember almost 10 years ago, maybe the TV show Transparent, which is really like the first time that like a real, fully embodied trans character was portrayed in a TV show, in a popular TV show. And I think it started this journey for a lot of people to really understand what that means and why somebody might feel that way and choose to live their life that way, right? Um, and I think about, movies and shows that I watched growing up that helped me understand perspectives that were not native to me, that were not identities that I identified with or that I ever considered or thought about. So for this book, that is truly the message from the beginning, which is I want the reader, remember the intended audience is 13 to 17-year-olds. So I want a 13 to 17-year-old who maybe has only interacted with the idea of undocumented people through, their conservative parents or racist depictions on the news. I want them to read this book and to walk away seeing, oh, Mateo is just like me. You know, this could have been me if I had been born differently, you know, um, and hopefully build empathy in those readers about real world people that they might meet or interact with. So yeah, for me, it's all about empathy, and it's also about family and it's about community. The only different ending that I ever had for this book was an extended ending that we cut down. Um, at the end, it ends with him hugging his grandmother. Um, the extended ending was him and his grandmother going back to um, a party at her, like a welcome home party at her house with the rest of his extended family. And it was like 4 pages, where just like a sort of epilogue on the story. But we had to cut it down. But that's all that, that's not really a different ending. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Matt kind of compiled all of these questions, but it's an opportunity if you have a question that Matt didn't include that you'd like to ask. Julio, now is your chance. Yeah. Well, you gotta speak up a little higher than that, so.
Hi, I am writing my thesis on magic realism right now, and I would be interested to know like who your biggest magic realist inspiration is.
Definitely, Marquez. Also, for me, like magical realism and surrealism, uh, often blend together for me. I think for magical realism, I think like a strict definition of it would be, the supernatural existing within the natural world, as if it's just a regular part of that natural order. Um, but for me, oftentimes magical realism is a way of opening the door to um, I guess the surrealism, opening the door to a new way of attacking a theme and of exploring a theme. And for me, that usually just leads me down the surrealism hole. Um, but I would say a lot of painters also, I wish I could name some off the top of my head, but I love a lot of these magical realism painters, a lot of surrealism painters. And oftentimes when I'm in like the blank slate, just exploration portion of my writing, which for me is my favorite part, which is just like anything can happen. I often look at art books that I have, or I live in New York City, so there's a million amazing museums that I can go to, and I just start using that as reference, and I just start picking little ideas, um, and through that building on whatever the core idea I might already have is, and then just building off from that. But yeah, I wish I could name more people for you, but I would say Marquez and then a lot of painters who will go unnamed right now because I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Other questions for Julio that you didn't get asked? Yeah, Julie.
Can you hear me from over here or?
I can hear you.
I was wondering how much of like the storytelling or like how much or like you deciding where the story's gonna go is like a collaborative effort between you and the artist, or is it really kind of like the artist is just kind of like trying to just put out what your intended story was?
It depends. When I started with Home, it was definitely a very clear line um, between this is the script, you draw the script. Um, but that was my first book, and I didn't have a relationship with Anna when we started working on that book. But that's also the relationship that I often have when I work for companies like Marvel or DC, because oftentimes I'll write a script and I'll have no idea who the artist is yet until after the script is done, and then they choose an artist based on like scheduling and all sorts of different things that have nothing to do with me. But the vast majority of my work is work that I I will have the idea, and at some point in developing that idea, I will bring in one of my friends who are an artist. So Jacoby Salcedo, who's the artist on Frontera, he's the artist that I work with the most. Yasmin Flores Montañez is another artist that I work with a lot. Gabby Mendez is another one. And these are all artists um, that I not just love their art, but they're among like some of my best friends. And oftentimes when I have an idea for a project, I immediately start thinking, who's the artist on this book? Like who within this sort of like repertoire company that I've built of artists that I work with, who's the one that is not just like their style is going to be the best fit, but also their interests and their experiences and their life story also suits the work. Because to me that's really important. That's why I work almost exclusively with Latino artists, because there's a specificity that you don't find if you're not coming from that same perspective. So with Frontera, Jacoby and I were together on this project for a long time. We pitched the short story together, the anthology version of it. So you know, this story in particular was collaborative because I was he's Mexican American. I'm not. Mateo is Mexican American. And Jacoby's story is much more, his family story is much more similar to Mateo's story than mine. So we were pulling a lot of elements from his own family lore, and obviously the research that I was doing as well. And then in other books, you know, like Si Se Puede, which is a nonfiction book about important Latino figures throughout US history. Yasmin drew that one, and she's Puerto Rican, grew up in Puerto Rico, massive Roberto Clemente fan. And she influenced the fact that we did an entire chapter on Roberto Clemente in that book because she just really wanted to draw a lot of baseball, you know? And I just ran with that. We did a whole like 30-page chapter on his life story. So it depends on the project. But for the most part, when it comes to books that I'm conceiving of, and it's not like Marvel or DC asking me like, what's your take on Batman or whatever? I'm bringing an artist in very early, and we are having a lot of conversations about the book and talking about it a lot, which influence what I end up writing on it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
I'm interested in the actual words, you know, the spoken dialogue, and how is that sort of interleaved with description initially, like a play would be? But then when you see the drawings, does that influence or perhaps modify what you want the characters to say? I'm interested in the interaction there.
Yeah, yes to both. So a comic book script is very similar to a screenplay or a stage play where there's action and dialogue. Except in a script, like I mentioned, you know, it'll say page 1, panel 1. What's the action that you see on panel 1? What is any text that you're going to read in that panel? Panel 2, same thing. But yeah, you know, I tend to be, you know, my scripts are filled with photo reference, you know, which is literally just like I have a folder on Dropbox where I just throw all these images that I collect while researching, and I'll link to it, you know. So like the first time that we see the border wall, I have pictures of which border wall are we talking about, because there's so many different border walls on the southern border. And the artist will go from there. So I tend to be very descriptive, but oftentimes, and I think very descriptive when I'm writing also. Like when I'm writing, I see the image in my head, but 9 times out of 10, when you work with a great artist, which these books that, you know, originate with me are all artists that I'm hand choosing, which I think are great artists. 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be what I imagined, even though when I wrote it, I see it in my head, but it's going to be better than what I saw in my head. And sometimes that does influence a change in dialogue. So like, for example, sometimes I'll shorten dialogue because I don't need all that dialogue. It's part of it's already being said in the art that they drew. So for me, like I go through generally like 2 to 4, generally 3 drafts of a script before an artist starts on it. And then an artist will do rough drawings, which is for me and the editor to give notes on, you know, like the composition on this one isn't working for me, or like, let's change it to this, or this composition is great, let's do more of that, whatever. And that's my first inkling of I'm going to change some of this dialogue. But generally, when the art is done, before the lettering goes on, I will split my screen and I'll have the art and I'll have the Word document, and I'll literally go panel by panel and I will be rewriting dialogue. And part of that is also just like, you know, it takes a long time to draw a book. So Frontera, it took Jacoby a year to draw it, and then maybe like another 3 months to color it. So that's a year removed from when I wrote it, right? And I went through 3 drafts of that book. So I already revised a lot, but now I took a year off from the book essentially. And now I'm revisiting it with new eyes. So some of it is because of the art, and some of it is because I reread it now and I'm like, that sucked. I need to rewrite that dialogue, you know? So yeah, it's yes to both of your questions.
Any final question? No? Julio, you mentioned earlier about your own identity. Have you settled on what you identify as now?
Yeah, I mean, I generally just, say Cuban and Colombian American. And, throughout my life, I have in different ways embraced and rejected one or the other. Depending on like whatever my weird prejudice towards the other was at the time, like growing up in Miami, there was a time where like I didn't want to be like everyone else and loud Cuban, and like brash and talking like a Cuban, and I embraced my Colombian identity more. And then there's been times where it's been the opposite, where like everyone's watching Narcos, and I'm like, I don't want anyone to ask me about fucking Pablo Escobar again, when they find out that I'm Colombian. Um, so, it's definitely something that I think changes and evolves over time. But at the end of the day, these are all made up things anyway, right? Like, um, before there was a Cuba, before there was a Colombia, it was all indigenous land, right? And the Colombian side of my family is very indigenous. And, there's all sorts of different ways that people can perceive what it means to be Cuban American or Colombian American. So I tend to, I don't want to say I don't think about it as much anymore, because I definitely do. But I'm less interested in these boxes at this point.
Linguistically, where does your Spanish fall? More Cuban or more Colombian?
Cuban. Yeah.
All right, well, he does have another engagement, so we have to say goodbye. But thank you, Julio, for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you for all the amazing questions and for taking the time to read the books. I really appreciate it.
We'll talk again soon.
All right. Take care, guys. Bye.